With me now to break down those and other races is political science professor John Kennedy. Kennedy teaches at Westchester University. He specializes in state politics and has written books on the legislature and Pennsylvania elections. Thanks for being here. And in fact, you are joining us from your classroom right now.
Hi, Lauren. Welcome to our class. It's our pleasure.
Well, I am glad to be in your class with you as well. Let's talk about this election. This was not a good election in Pennsylvania for Republicans. Why did they fall short in a year when traditionally you'd expect them to do well?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, history suggests that in a president's midterm, the administration's party tends to lose seats. Pennsylvania was, by any kind of measure, was an excellent night for the Democrats. And some of it was expected, some unexpected. I think, you know, we had a rare occasion in Pennsylvania in that we had an open House, an open gubernatorial seat, an open U.S. Senate seat. We had new maps for the congressional races. We had new maps for state House and state Senates, and all down the line, the Democrats had success. And I think you need to begin at the top, and some of that relates to the candidates themselves at the.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those races. Let's talk about the Senate race, for example. This is one that there was some expectation that this might take longer to get a result and that it would be closer than it ended up being. What do you attribute that to when you look at John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz and that matchup there?
That's a good question. I think everyone was surprised by the size of the victory. We anticipated a very close election, one that might, we might still be tabulating the votes. I think when you go back and look at the campaign, through the primary season, I think the key was the summer period when the Fetterman campaign was able to define Mehmet Oz as a carpetbagger, as someone who was not from this state, and that I think it stuck. And despite the Oz campaign, despite some of the health issues that John Fetterman had in the fall, I don't think that was anything that Mehmet Oz was able to ever overcome. And I think, his message, Mehmet Oz's message in the fall, sort of moderation as we came down the home stretch, was a good message. But nevertheless, even though the polls showed it closing, Oz's unfavorables were never below 50%. And I think that was a real warning sign for his campaign. And I guess, whether it was unique to Pennsylvania, sometimes outsiders can be successful. We've seen that throughout, recent political history, but for whatever reason, Oz was never able to overcome that charge that he was not a Pennsylvanian.
You know, when we look at, you mentioned the primary system, and I wonder, as Republicans take a look at what happened here and analyze this and go forward, what really role the primary system had in this when you're talking about, Oz as somebody who at the very end had that message of moderation, had that message of balance, but he was in a situation in the primary where he was having to sort of push off some more moderate things that he had said and instead embrace some more policies to the right.
I don't think that was necessarily a problem with Oz per se. I think he did take some stances that he backed away from, but I do think that that the strong support that he had from the former president Donald Trump certainly helped him in the primary, and I don't think he was ever able to get out from under that shadow, even though he tried to avoid mentioning the former president as we got closer to the election day. It was certainly a major, whether or not he was the top candidate, and for the Republicans heading into the fall, Trump's endorsement certainly, I think, was the deciding factor in him receiving the Republican nomination.
How much of a factor do you think former President Trump was in Pennsylvania?
Well, I think he was certainly a major factor as far as Mehmet Oz and not Dave McCormick being the Republican nominee. I don't necessarily think he pushed Doug Mastriano over the finish line. His endorsement there came in very late, and it was really pretty much at a time of fait accompli that Mastriano was going to be the nominee.
But in the end, I mean, in the final stage of this election, he was here in Pennsylvania that final weekend with the two of them at that time when Oz was trying to take a moderate position, which was conflicting with that kind of appearance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that necessarily helped. I mean, Oz had sort of avoided any kind of shared campaign and being on the same stage with Doug Mastriano, and that rally the weekend before out in Latrobe with Mastriano and Trump, I don't think necessarily helped him in the Philadelphia in the suburban areas where he really suffered and struggled mightily, and so I don't think that message. You're absolutely right. Did conflict with that more moderate image that he was trying to present late in the game.
You mentioned the suburbs. I wanted to ask you specifically about the suburbs around Philadelphia, known as the collar counties, and the power that they seem to be now wielding in statewide races. We saw President Biden really boost the margins from what Hillary Clinton had in those collar counties. And largely, it looks like John Fetterman was able to hold on to those margins and get so many votes in those areas. Are those suburbs now playing a larger role for Democrats when it comes to statewide races?
Well, absolutely. And that's been the big shift in Pennsylvania over the last 15, 20 years. The suburbs of Philadelphia, which at one time were strongly Republican and were really the vital for Republicans statewide, have now shifted dramatically to the Democrats. We've seen just this past week, John Fetterman picking up 63% in places like Delco and Monco. Josh Shapiro doing even better. That has really changed the dynamics within the state, and it has helped counterbalance Republican support in what were traditionally Democratic areas, particularly in the southwestern and some of the more rural parts of the state in the northeast. So the state does remain competitive, at the macro level, but at the micro level, there have been some dramatic changes in Pennsylvania over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, what does that do to Philadelphia? Because, the thought was always that you got to have a huge turnout in Philadelphia for a Democrat to win statewide. We don't know what that turnout was yet, but we know that the suburbs turned out.
Yeah, and I think indications of our turnout was robust in Philadelphia, and I think you sort of combine those votes, and Democrats need a strong showing, not just in the suburbs, but they do need to turn out voters in Philadelphia, and by all indications, they certainly did this past week, and they were overwhelming. Josh Shapiro took roughly 85% of the vote in Philadelphia County. So, that's a big pocket of voters in this state, and it's difficult for any Republican candidate to overcome those numbers throughout the Commonwealth when the Democrats are running that strongly.
All right, John Kennedy, political science professor with Westchester University. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.